Testing, testing.
Maybe this one says.
I think the guys on the back and right of the front. Now, it's interesting how people fit together. It's like the guys. The guys are now representing the front and the other guys are even in my year, there's always very few guys taking things. Oh man, yeah, it's true, it's true. Also, I think these for male perspectives in my opinion. Okay, and start to yeah. I've got a PhD. I'm not a professor. I'm just a contract lecturer because they're looking for someone to have classes. But they want someone who has a specialism that's different. I'm born into second language education, second language acquisition. Linguistics, that's my thing. And sociolinguistics. They're looking for someone who's experiencing discourse analysis. Well, I have done a bit of this, but I haven't done it in PhD. I've done it about I did it as part of my master's, but it was just one specific. So I'm familiar with it. I'm not experienced. I did try it. Yeah, so just got to do it. Okay. Well, I mean, Jed wrote saying you can use it to go into languages, so like for instance, African languages or the other languages that want education different. I think one of the problems historically is it's a bit strong applied languages. So it's where you take, you apply to problems in the world. So that's what education is why. That's the main one actually. So, yeah, I mean, there's opportunities there if you're taking them. I think you can also teach. It helps you if you get a TTC link to a secondary level. Obviously, third year, you understand how language works, understand students. So, otherwise, it's like an academic part. To some degree, to be honest, at the moment, I'm not learning anything more about reading. I'm learning programming languages, so it's constructed languages, it's still languages. Yeah, you can't lecture become a programmer. All right, everyone, welcome. Okay. Welcome to week 3. I'm really looking forward to this lecture. We probably won't finish it, it's really long, but next week we'll just carry on where we stopped today. Okay, so just a few housekeeping things. On Are You Connected? I haven't sent out like an announcement or anything, but please do look. I've uploaded details about the main assessment, which is due pretty much in a month's time on the 20th of March. So it's got the marking rubric. It's an essay. In quick summary, you have to interview someone about their experience of language learning, second language learning, and then apply some of the theories and then some of the lectures, particularly the next couple of weeks, which are dealing more with factors that aren't necessarily theories in and of themselves, but what they'd call cognitive and affective factors and the social factors in second language acquisition. So what the essay is asking you to do is you get some data by interviewing someone. You then apply your knowledge that you've learned in this course on that data, and then you write something about how second language acquisition occurred. All right. I think I added a little bit to it based on what it used to be. I want you to transcribe part of your interview as well, and add that as an appendix. But anyway, so there's more details about that on Are You Connected? And I encourage you to check it out. It's due in just about a month's time. Okay, and then also from this next Friday, if any of you have questions about your marks for the quizzes, you can ask your tutors and they'll be able to tell you. So I've set up a system where they'll be able to check and then they'll give you your mark directly, or your marks, plural. Okay, so today we are turning to different theories, and this is, I think, more interesting territory, at least for me, than the previous ones where we were focusing on two ways of analyzing, which almost became theories, contrastive analysis and then error analysis. And these constitute more of what I would consider a theory, where it's really trying to take in all the elements of what happens when you learn a language or acquire a language. I should be using acquire, I think, a bit more here, in order to understand the overall phenomenon of second language acquisition. So it's not just focusing in on one way of analyzing two different languages like the L1 and the L2, or analyzing errors and then trying just to derive an understanding from that. It's looking, well, what are all the components or the necessary conditions that then would lead to you acquiring a language successfully? And you can kind of see that in the title here. I mean, if I were to ask you to come up quickly with a theory of how second language acquisition works, you'd probably find something that's similar to, there needs to be some kind of input that you receive. And there needs to be some kind of maybe interaction with other people, because obviously languages exist only in the context of communication and other people. So you'd probably come up with a few things and you'd focus in on them, and then you'd build your theory around that. And what's happened here, and we're going to be looking at Krashen's theory in particular, is he focused on input and several other hypotheses that he had, which together, cumulatively, are Krashen's model. It's called the monitor model. There's a few names for it. It also evolved over time. And monitor, just when you think about monitor, it's in the sense of something monitoring something else. So a monitor in an exam, if you can just, like, they're looking down at students who are at the desks writing an exam. So just think of the monitor model in that sense. And it doesn't describe all elements of Krashen's hypotheses, but it gives a good quick way of understanding an important distinction he makes between what learning is and what acquisition is, which we'll get into now. Okay, so we've kind of looked in last week at the impact of universal grammar, or Chomsky's approach to second language acquisition. And one of the things there was that, okay, obviously you've got a LAD, language acquisition device, for your first language. You have an innate capacity for language learning. With regard to second language learning, arguably the second hypothesis from last week's reading was correct, in my opinion at least, which is that the universal grammar puts boundaries on your development of interlanguage, right? So it gives you kind of parameters on how it can develop that are based on these universal language features. Okay, so second language learning is seen, at least from an innatist perspective, of utilizing the same mechanisms that were used in the L1 in a different way because you already have an L1, right? Okay. But it's also hindered. So there are these things that are, again, from an innatist perspective, there are others. There are certain things where cognitive maturation, your brain isn't as plastic. Negative affective states, arguably, maybe children are just a bit more joyous, hopefully, than adults who have far more responsibilities and cares in their life. And obviously, it's just difficult, unless you're in a fully immersed environment in the target language, to get sufficient amount of input in that language. So it's a bit different for second language acquisition. But as a result of, I guess, an innatist perspective, so Chomsky would be included, they emphasize that it's the input that is being received that was almost like a primary factor in how the acquisition occurs. Okay, and I think this is now more Krashen, Stephen Krashen, who really wants to make this distinction, but between learning and acquisition, two distinct processes. So we'll look at that in more detail now. But before we get there, just to clarify some distinctions between competence and performance. So performance, I'll start there. Performance just refers to how people just say things, the actual language that they use. It's the way that they perform whatever linguistic knowledge they have. Whereas competence is that knowledge that's kind of in your mind, and it has maybe mental representations that you draw on intuitively as you speak or as you write or whatever. But performance is the outward expressions of that competence or lack of competence as well. Okay, so we're going to really be focusing in on where that competence comes from. And I think that's one of the important, when we're trying to understand the distinction between acquisition and learning, it's about, well, where is competence coming from? Because if competence is what leads then to performance, then how do we get competence? Okay, so Krashen, just a quote from him, we do not acquire it by producing it, by performing language. It's only by understanding it and developing the ability to comprehend or understand. Because from a place of comprehension or understanding, then we can perform, right? Okay, so anyway, so just kind of an overview of it, the monitor model. It's a bit ambiguous, elements of it, which we'll see. You also see this in the reading for this week. I'm getting a spam call, sorry. Yeah, in the 70s and 80s, particularly the 70s, and Stephen Krashen pioneered this, right? I think a few other people maybe were involved, but it was almost all him. He does come from the innatist tradition. So he does tend to see that there are overlaps, large overlaps from acquiring an L1 and an L2. And for him, his doctrine, it's almost like a religious doctrine in his case, but it's all about input and specifically comprehensible input. It can't be incomprehensible. So it needs to have some degree of you need to have some degree of prior knowledge in order to understand at least part of what you're hearing in order to actually acquire. Yeah, so you can see this point here is written almost to say that he maybe wasn't the most academic scholar. He was more focused on actually practitioners of language. So that would be teachers in particular, who maybe are not geared towards like research and wanting to understand things deeply, but more just interested in practice. And so the fact that he geared his research more towards practice as an applied linguist, maybe rather more than he was a linguist, has meant that at least the reception to some of his work maybe wasn't as fair as it ought to have been. At least if you read the reading for this week, that is probably the argument they're making there. So yeah, some of the problems that people identified, and all of this will make more sense as we go through it now. I guess this is just preliminary stuff about Krashen's model, but he doesn't define his terms well enough. So there's an ambiguity, and so what is input? What is it? What part of language is the input referring to? Is it just vocabulary, or is it something else? Is it an entire sentence? Is it an utterance? Like, he was never too specific, at least in some of his early work. Also, at least initially, it lacked some empirical evidence. And that was the critique that people made. Another critique was that he made a theory, but there was no way to falsify the theory. And I mean, if any of you have done any other disciplines, which I guess talk a lot about the nature of science, you'll know how important it is that a theory needs to be falsifiable. Otherwise, there's no real way of knowing if it's true or not. Because if it doesn't have a condition under which it is false, then it will always find a way to explain every single element of a phenomenon. And yeah, you can't tell if it's true or not then. So that was a critique made of the monitor model. Okay, so there's five main hypotheses that he kind of worked with. The first is the distinction between acquisition and learning, which we'll get to next. Then it's the monitor hypothesis, which is where the name of the model comes from. It's a bit weird that they just focus in on monitor for the name of the overall model, but that's just how it happened. Then the natural order hypothesis. And as we're going through these, maybe you can just start thinking what the names might refer to. So what is the monitor that's looking over your shoulder? What is the natural order of what? Language development? What would it be? The input hypothesis, I guess, probably has to do with the input that you receive. And then effective filter. And effective is, I guess, just a fancy word of really things that relate to your emotional states, things that aren't necessarily cognitive, but have to do with the other elements of being human. So emotion is, I guess, the best way of looking at that. So an emotional filter that then affects language learning, presumably. Okay, so looking at firstly, the first hypothesis. So there's two distinct and independent ways of developing competence. At least this is one way of looking at it, that there's acquisition, which happens subconsciously, and it's intuitive. There's no kind of intention as you are getting all these kind of intuitive rules in your head. It's just happening in the background. It's like passive. Versus learning, which is conscious, which kind of deals in rules, figuring out how things work officially. Krashen thought actually learning is not important. And sometimes learning is super counterproductive. So when you are consciously trying to do something, actually, it doesn't necessarily mean then that you are acquiring competence in a language. But learning is more, as it said there, used to produce correct form and grammar. And whereas acquisition is more just about understanding and meaning. So yeah, some criticisms of this distinction that he's making, that like, well, surely it's porous. Like if you can see a Venn diagram, that acquisition and learning are slightly overlapping with each other. There is a point at which surely as you learn, you would develop some competence because of consistent input that's occurring, that is developing things which maybe relate to the explicit way that you're being instructed. For instance, you need to say went instead of goed. And maybe that happens enough times and then it can become subconscious and intuitive. So there's ways of kind of quibbling with this it's almost a dichotomy. You've got on the one side learning, on the other side, you have acquisition. And then, yeah, I guess a big debate, and this is, it's interesting to kind of understand what the motivation for the debates in research or scholarship are. About whether learning can become acquisition. Because obviously what Krashen is doing here is like a big challenge to an entire industry, which is the education industry. And that is all about teaching and learning and explicit learning. So if, for instance, the way that you would learn a language is similar to how I'm lecturing right now. I mean, you guys are not interacting with me, you are not speaking, you're getting input, sure, but there's no kind of practice going on. I don't know if you, as you're doing this, trying to kind of engage and intuitively develop rules about the nature of SLA, as opposed to just maybe taking some notes and then later looking at them, swatting for the exam. You know, you have knowledge in your head, then like by this time next year, you'll probably have forgotten most of it, right? So it's not skill-based, right? So language acquisition is I guess, more focused on skill rather than just knowledge. Anyway, so I'm going on a tangent there. We'll probably return to that later. So anyway, Krashen said quite a thing that was just scandalous. Learning cannot become acquisition. So you'll read in the reading, and yeah, I think the reading is fascinating because it's established scholars within SLA who are now looking back at Krashen's work 40 years later and are saying, well, actually, a lot of the things that he came up with, maybe he was a bit ambiguous and maybe it wasn't too evidence-based, but actually his hypotheses have largely borne out. The evidence is now there. It's just people use different names and words for them. So one of them, which would be the distinction between implicit learning and explicit learning. So the implicit, explicit kind of difference there. And that acquisition is just you're implicitly learning something when you're doing something. You're not directly trying to learn it, but it's happening implicitly. And so we use different language, but actually it's like maybe the same thing as his distinction. So this is just a quote from the reading. I won't go into it. You'll read it in the reading. So, but the idea here, and this has kind of been borne out in the literature, in research, that explicit learning plays a relatively minor role. I mean, there are some important things that it can do, but it more contributes to meta-linguistic knowledge, what you know about language as opposed to how you can language as a verb, right? Okay. So that's the first one, the distinction between learning and acquisition. And maybe some of you you can just think through your own experiences, not necessarily of language learning. Obviously, language learning is one skill which some of you have learned. Maybe some of you have learned musical instruments, even things like mathematics. There's almost like a skill to maths that you have to just practice and like get into habits of mind or habits of, muscles. And, there are certain ways of learning that just do not contribute actually to you developing those skills. And I've certainly encountered that. I think when I was younger, I went to some piano lessons, which the way I was taught was just so unengaging. And I just went through the motions, but I actually didn't acquire anything that had lasting value. And that happens a lot for second language learning as well. Okay, so moving on to the monitor hypothesis. This is where so this is now what I guess the contention or claim of Krashen is that, sure, okay, learning does not lead to acquisition. So acquisition is the main thing. We should focus on acquisition. But learning does have a purpose. And I don't know if he would say that the purpose is that good, but one of the things that it does do is it helps monitor or edit that which we have acquired, particularly when we are trying to produce language. So whether we are writing or speaking. And what learning does is it gives us a framework for thinking, well, I've just produced this sentence or this word, or, I've added this tense marker on here or done whatever. And is it correct? So when you're learning things, it helps you to notice the things that you have kind of explicitly learned when you are now producing and your kind of implicit knowledge is at work. And you can then monitor. There's like this kind of looking over the shoulder of yourself. So yeah, acquisition is what initiates the utterance, just the thing that comes forth from you, but then learning is what enables you to monitor those utterances. So I think this came from the previous maker of the slides. I'm just going to skip that. But in terms of the function of the monitor, so sometimes it depends on how individuals are, how quick they are able to get their monitor to like edit an utterance. Sometimes they can do it before. So as they are in process of saying something, they'll be like, oh, wait, I'm starting to say something in the wrong way. Let me alter that. Usually it's afterwards, you would correct yourself in some way. And so anyway, so this is in general his hypothesis, is that like you just develop this monitor, this language monitor through learning. You don't really develop too much like implicit knowledge or actual like acquisition of language when you learn. You just have this thing on your shoulder that's telling you, no, you're getting that right or wrong. Okay, so yeah, there's a few criticisms of this. Yeah, I mean, sometimes conscious rules, sometimes not. The question is, again, there's like this, when is the monitor unconscious? If the monitor is unconscious, isn't that the same thing as it being part of your like competence? And it's like the rules that are implicit in you. So that's why earlier, one of the main critiques is that the natural order hypothesis. This is just the idea that there's a predictable order in which how people acquire language. And obviously this has implications then for how you would teach a language, because if you can follow that natural order, rather than going to something that maybe you'd only learn at the advanced stages, maybe you can kind of help people just at the right level where they need to be and to learn quicker. So you can and at least initially, I'm pretty sure he modified this, if this is actually what he did say, that there's a natural order for each person. Doesn't matter what kind of how they've been instructed in the language, and it's just as a result of the system that they have acquired kind of passively through their exposure to a whole bunch of input, and it's not based on like the grammar that they've learned, right? That the monitor is telling them. So if there's just a natural order, and this thing doesn't happen because of conscious intention, it just happens. So yeah, I think he drew on some evidence from morpheme studies that, at least in first language acquisition is pretty. So you can kind of see he's coming from an innatist approach, and he's drawing on how first language acquisition, and there is a natural order to how children learn different sounds and different kind of particles of language. So he's now taking that as an analogy into second language learning. So yeah, there's quite a few criticisms that you can, I think, validly make on this, that just there's different ways of learning, and that can produce then different kind of patterns of acquiring certain features of language. So again, that's assuming that learning does have some impact on acquisition. Then also, I guess the nature of the L1 and that which is being transferred obviously impacts. So like if you have a certain frame for how tense works in your language, then that is also going to impact the way that you would acquire another language too. And so I guess one way of just trying to nullify the strong claim here is that, well, okay, cool. Some things can be learned before others, but not always. So you put a bit of an asterisk on this hypothesis and just weaken it. So here's an example of, I guess, moving from a natural order, learning the verb be, which is not inflected, it's not kind of made for tense or the number of people, and then that verb can be used as an auxiliary verb, and it's saying here that articles then would come next in terms of like the natural order of how you'd acquire English in this case. Then you'd be able to go to a regular past, etc., etc. So this is just kind of an idea that he came up with. Okay, so now in the reading, you'll read that actually, at least according to like pretty reputable scholars, Van Patten in particular, he's written a lot. He and his co-author Lichter, they said, well, actually, this hypothesis has largely been shown to be true if you just make some modifications. And one of them, this is the way that they put it, is that there's an ordered development. And like, this is factual. It's not just theory or hypothesis. Like, it's been shown that there is an ordered development. But they wanted to get away from the idea that there's a natural order, as in you would definitely go from this to this to this to this. But there is an order to the development. It's just not necessarily natural for everyone. So, you know, individual differences, different languages come in. But within each individual learner, there is an ordered development. It doesn't happen randomly. So you're not just going to randomly pick up a super unusual tense like right at the beginning of learning, right? Which is, I think, pretty commonsensical. Okay, so that's 3 of the hypotheses that we've looked at. This is probably the one that's received the most focus. And I think also just from the perspective of, if you're looking at how second language acquisition works, looking at input is really interesting, especially if you've had experiences of it yourself, because you can kind of then see, well, when I was doing, sorry, yeah? Yeah. Sorry? Maybe in some way, but I think the overgeneralization is more almost like a mechanism at a certain stage that would mean that you have certain rules that you've acquired that are being applied, but then you would break them. You'd have to learn to break them, right? So I think that would occur across multiple different parts of language that might have an order in acquisition. But that's more of like a thing that's happening at a higher level. Overgeneralize it. You'd overgeneralize certain rules. Yeah, it's as opposed to specific things like picking up this tense and then picking up articles and things like that. So yeah, one is like almost a mechanism that is occurring. The other one are the actual pieces of language that are. So just to distinguish between those two. Okay. So any other questions? Maybe I haven't really been. Please do feel free just to put up your hand and say, hey, slow down, or I want to ask a question about that. Okay, so the input hypothesis. So obviously, input's super important. Like, I wouldn't have learned English or any of the second languages that I've learned. Whether I know them still is a different matter, but if I hadn't received a lot of input and gotten that from somewhere, and not just the input, which is kind of coming to me, also then there's an intake that needs to happen in order for it to kind of become internalized, become implicit. Yeah, and so this is, I guess, Krashen's main contention here. His most famous one is that this is the route to acquisition. You just need to have input, but not any kind of input. It has to be comprehensible. So obviously he spent quite a bit of time figuring out, well, what is comprehensible? So his main idea, and this is a formulation that has had many criticisms, as you can kind of see, is that the input, whatever that input is, it needs to be slightly ahead, just slightly ahead of your current state of knowledge. So if, for example, I say a sentence where you can understand, let's say 90% of the words I'm using, 90% of the grammatical patterns, but there's a 10% where something strange is going on, and but that's maybe like the right amount. It's like it's input that I already understand, but then there's just this +1, this little extra bit, and doesn't overwhelm the system that I have, my cognitive system, for trying to process that and then derive, I guess, the rules implicitly that are going on there. So yeah, a lot of people in the aftermath of this have tried to figure out, well, what is this I? What is input? Is it just vocabulary? Or is it, specific way, like structures or grammar structures? And in terms of testing this, so like falsifying this hypothesis, which would obviously be an important thing, I think it's also just difficult to operationalize it, to use the terminology. How would you find a way to bring this into something that you can quantify and then measure to see whether I plus 1 actually is the correct equation, as it were, for how acquisition occurs. So again, in the reading, they focused on this. So in the reading, they focused on 3 of his hypotheses. We're going through all the 5 main ones. But they did look at this one, and their updated version of this is that instead of talking about comprehensible input, because that comprehensible thing and the fact that it's just input received a lot of critique, they said, well, it needs to be communicatively embedded, as in the input is taking place when there is when obviously the person is embedded in a situation where communication, two-way communication is taking place, right? And that's where, as it were, input is comprehensible, or at least wants to be comprehensible, right? Because if there's two-way communication taking place and people are not getting each other at all, like that communication will fail and will probably not continue. So the input then needs to be in a situation where there's almost a desire for it to be comprehensible, right? So they've kind of reframed it in some ways, but the way that they've reframed it is then looking at all subsequent research kind of 40 years later after the input hypothesis was made. And this has come out again and again and again. There is this communicative act that's so important to language learning because it affects like the desire that people have to understand, which is obviously, I guess, a motivation. So that's an effective factor. But yeah, basically, this input, which is communicatively embedded, is what Krashen said. And certainly if you were to read some of his later stuff, this is what he said. So I think, unfortunately for Krashen, and he complains of this, that people just read his first stuff in 1982, kind of his main thing, and then everything, all 400 or however many journal articles and things that he's written, they just ignored that. So any of his modifications to his own theories were ignored, and they just took his initial version. Okay. So I think moving on to the final hypothesis then is the effective filter, and I kind of alluded to it just now. And I see that image has come up there. So, I mean, you could make a distinction. There's input, but that's like bringing a horse to water. You can't make it drink. There needs to be intake of that water. So similarly for language, there needs to be intake of the input that is provided. And intake then is, I guess, what has been comprehended, as opposed to that which is hopefully comprehensible. So yeah, effective filter is, as he argued, Krashen argued, this is the principal way of understanding why some learners succeed and why others don't. So because of something effective, something maybe emotional, something relating to your motivation, you could block out input as kind of not being relevant to you, or you can just ignore it entirely. Like, for instance, maybe some of the input that I'm giving right now is not being taken in simply because it's like there's other things. You're feeling things, maybe you're feeling super tired. Maybe your mind is dwelling on, what someone said to you or whatever. So you can kind of see how this is relevant for learning and also acquisition, obviously both of those two things. If there is this effective stuff going on in a person as they are, needing to learn, then it can really like get in the way of actual acquisition. Okay, so the claim was that it affects acquisition more than learning, and that the ideal situation would be where the filter is weak. So he kind of constructed in a way that if you have a weak filter, it means that there aren't a lot of effective things going on that are getting in the way of that comprehensible input. You are kind of primed to receive it and to take it in. So here's an example that I took from his main work in 1982. So optimal input focuses the acquirer on the message and not the form. So in effect, if you were to hear, let's say in your second language or third language, you were to hear a sentence, and whatever they're talking about, you catch specific words that maybe reveal that they're talking about one of your favorite topics. So that's kind of the content or the message, as opposed to what it's about. And what would be your motivation to comprehend that? Would it be because, I'm a language learner, that's my identity, I need to figure out this? No, it's probably because the content actually is engaging and interesting to you. So this is a claim that he made in 1982, that the best input is so interesting and relevant that the acquirer may even forget that the message is encoded in a foreign language, right? So that's kind of what he says is ideal. And if, for instance, it's super interesting and relevant, that can make that filter, that effective filter, low. It can overwhelm the other effective things going on because the content is so interesting. Okay, so the filter, it kind of determines which part of the language will be attended to first. So at a high level, whether you're focusing on the content or on the form. And then also, like if there's a filter and it's quite high, it might then say, well, I'm going to try and process and comprehend this information up to a certain point. But you know what, I can't figure out this, so I'm just going to stop here. Like, it's not too relevant to me. And I mean, so if you have a whole bunch of responsibilities and someone then comes up to you and then maybe in your second language and tries to sell you something, but you have to go somewhere, your effective filter is probably very high. All right, and a third function that's mentioned here is just, the idea is that obviously acquisition will take place if sufficient comprehensible input is happening, but this effective filter is kind of what negotiates the level of progress that you would make. So whether it's quick or slow. So this is just a hypothesis about how it works. So he's kind of got this effective filter. You've got the monitor. We'll look at all of them now together, actually. So I'm not gonna look at them now. But I think this is a prediction that he made, that adolescence is the worst period for learning, just because the effective filter is super high. So maybe that's part of the reason why there's a critical period is that once puberty hits, adolescence, then there's just a lot of stuff going on in people's brains, hormones, that then mean you're just not receptive to input, and particularly then in a second language. So yeah, and also implication that certain personality traits that maybe, if any of you do psychology in the Big Five model, one of them is negative emotion, and if you're quite high then in that, according to this, you might have quite a bit of social when you maybe are learning a second language, and that would doom your acquisition, which I think has certainly come out that obviously will affect, your personality affects it, but just because you would have these things that, at least in Krashen's language, would give you a high filter, doesn't necessarily mean then that you actually will filter out the inputs and then it won't be taken in. So yeah, another critique, again, just like people love to critique Krashen on this, and to some degree, maybe the initial early version of Krashen's work was just imprecise. So yeah, okay. So in summary, and learning using, I guess, not the language of the hypotheses themselves, there's comprehensible input, and that's just beyond their current level of proficiency or competence. Then there's the explicit and implicit learning, that's unconscious learning or conscious learning. So that's his acquisition learning. The natural order, which people have subsequently said is just a ordered development. The monitor that I discussed right at the beginning of this lecture, and then emotional factors, so the effective filter. So there you can kind of see them all mapped out. And this picture also has just some interesting information. If you look up at the top at the monitor hypothesis, if your monitor is overused, then in effect, you're critiquing your own use of language too much. So this was, I think, he tried to work with these hypotheses, then work out, well, elaborate on them, go quite deeply. And this is one of the ways he did it, that people who don't use their monitor sufficiently, their accuracy, their ability to accurately use the grammatical particles or good vocabulary, maybe they'll just throw out language and they're not like monitoring how they're speaking. but there's a balance that's optimal. So there is some value to having a monitor. It's not all bad. Cool. All right, so we finishing in 5 minutes, right? Okay, cool. So yeah, and kind of a natural conclusion to the lecture. I won't try and speed into the next one. So yeah, the theory is 40 years old, but it's still relevant today. And I think when this course was first put together, the academic community, or at least those who are well respected in the academic community, hadn't really come to this conclusion that it's still relevant. And actually, a lot of these hypotheses just need slight modifications, but they're largely true. That they're not just theories or hypotheses, they're actually factual. So if you read the reading, you'll kind of see the discourse within SLA about Krashen and about Krashen's theories over time, as well as the evidence for or against those hypotheses. And then one last thing I'll say as well, we briefly in the reading, there was a little blurb about the audiolingual method, which was very much based on kind of a behaviorist way where you just repeat certain like words and phrases, and then the idea is eventually you're going to acquire the language, and you're like, because you acquire like a child, that's the idea, you will just work out the grammar from like saying one sentence 100 times. And that was one of the standard ways that you would teach a language. At least, certainly if you wanted to learn a language yourself, you'd get like an audio course and then you just listen to that thing like crazy. But as a result of Krashen, the CLT, the acronyms come to be known by, became extremely popular, which is just focused on, in effect, building a language education system that's focused on giving comprehensible input to children. Children in particular, but not just children, adults as well, as the best way for learning. So if any of you do, and we probably will go a bit into different pedagogical kind of methodologies for second language acquisition towards the end of the course. So we will probably look at some of these like communicative language teaching. Yeah, all right. This will be for next week. So I'll see you next week. A reminder, just please do look at Are You Connected? I've uploaded a bunch of things there, and you'll see all the details about your assessment, which is due on the 20th, Thursday, the 20th of March.